So you have learned how to consume a context object in your component tree. But what if you want to update the context? That's what I'm going to show you in this video. So in this little app that we have built, we are assuming that the user is initially logged in. We're going to change this behavior and simulate the scenario where the user is not logged in. Then we're going to build a login component with a button. When we press the button, the user should log in, and then we should see the user's name over here. Now, before we get started, I want to clean up this UI a little bit. So here's our movie list component, and here's our movie row component. I want to add a label here like movie row for clarity. So let's go to the movie row component and add this label, movie row. Save the changes. Now we have a consistent UI. Okay, beautiful. So how can we update the context? Well, look at our app component. In this user context, we're providing this object, which is part of the state of the app component. Now, I got a question for you. Forget about the context for a second. How can we update the state of a component higher in the component tree? We talked about this earlier in the course. So because we have the state here, we should also provide methods for updating the state here, and then pass those methods as props to our child components. So over here, I'm going to add a method called handle logged in. Let's say we get a username. This is the value that the user enters on the login form. So we get the username. Now we should call the server and get information about this user. I'm going to simulate that using a console.log statement. So getting the user with this username. Okay. Now let's imagine we get a user object from the server with the name set to Mosh. Now we should call this.setState. We're going to set the current user property to the user object that we get from the server. Okay. Now we have a method for updating the state. We should pass this method just like the current user using our context object. So we're going to change the structure of the object that we're passing down. Instead of passing down the current user, I'm going to pass an object with two properties. One of them is current user, which we set to this.state.current user. The other is a property called onLoggedIn, which we set to this.handle logged in. Let's save the changes. So take a look. This is the object that we're passing down in our component tree using our context. Now we should modify our child components because we have changed the structure of the object that we're passing down. So let's go to movie list. Our user context no longer has a property called name. It has a property called current user. Now current user may be null, so we need to check for it. So let's write an expression like this. User context dot current user. If this is truthy, then we're going to read user context dot current user dot name. Otherwise, we're going to return an empty string. Save the changes. Now we should make the same change in the movie row component. So movie row. Now here I've called this object current user. Let's rename this to user context. Otherwise, we'll end up with current user.current-user.name. So rename user context. One more time. If user context that current user is truthy, we're going to read user context that current user.name. Otherwise, we're going to get an empty string. Save the changes. So our application is still working. We haven't implemented the concept of updating the context. We have simply changed the structure of the context object. Okay. Now to update the context, let's add a new component called login. So login.jsx. Let's use a functional component here. So RSF tab, beautiful. Now let's add a button with a label like login. We should handle the onClick event here. Now, what should we call here? We should call the handle logged in method that we passed down from our app component. So in app component, this is the object that we're passing down using the context. So back in the login component, let's import the useContext hook. Now, we call useContext. What kind of context do we want to use here? User context. So we get the result and store it over here. Now, here we should pass a Lambda expression. So whenever this button is clicked, we're going to call userContext that on logged in. And in this form, we know the username of this user. So whatever that is, we're going to pass that here. When the user clicks on this button, the handle logged in method in the app component gets executed. This is where we get the user information from the server and then update the state. Now, the moment the state gets updated, this value prop will also be updated because here we're using this, that state, that current user, right? So this provider is going to provide a new context object to our component tree. Now, all consumers will be notified and they will refresh themselves. We're almost done. Now, we should set the current user to null and also add the login component over here. So login, there you go. Save the changes. Let's test our application. So initially we're not logged in. That's why we don't see my name over here. Now let's click on the login button. There you go. So this verifies that we successfully updated the context object. So to recap, to update the context, we added this method in our app component. This is the method that is responsible for updating the state. And then we pass this method down using our context object. With this, any component in our component tree can call this method, just like how they can access the current user.